This event is investing in effective climate resiliency, climate finance for all peoples. And now let's welcome to the stage Jade Begay, Policy and Advocacy Director, NDN Collective. Woohoo! For a warm welcome. Warm welcome.
Hello, everyone. Oh, I always gotta. Okay, does this work? Can people hear me? Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. As was shared, my name is Jade Begay. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director at NDN Collective. And welcome again to this panel hosted by NDN Collective. For those of you that are just learning about our organization, NDN is a U.S.-based, Indigenous-led organization dedicated to building Indigenous power through organizing, activism, philanthropy, grant-making, capacity building, and narrative change. We are creating sustainable solutions on Indigenous terms. In our short 5 years, we have become the largest Indigenous-led fund in U.S. history and have moved over $60 million to over 800 tribes and Indigenous-led organizations, I should say. Yes. Round of applause for us. We're really proud of the impact. So on today's panel, we're going to discuss what does it mean for governments, philanthropy, and the private sector to give Indigenous peoples the autonomy to pursue the building of a better world informed by practices and cultures of justice, care, and trust. In this session, we're going to unpack how NDN Collective, our team, is addressing extractive finance systems in government and philanthropy while paving a just and equitable path for impact investment, climate finance, and grant making. So I'm going to intro our team and welcome them up. But before you walk up, I'm just going to share who you all are. So first, we have Kim Pate, NDN Fund Managing Director, who is a descendant of the Eastern Band, Cherokee, and Mississippi Choctaw tribes. Kim leads the daily operations of the organization, supporting communications and evaluation, and plays important strategic and communications roles within NDN Collective. She has a bachelor's degree in political science from Stanford University and a Juris Doctorate from University of California at Los Angeles School of Law. Pate is admitted to practice in Nez Perce Tribal Court and California. Welcome, Kim and Pate. That just threw me off. Welcome, Kim, to the stage. Next, we have Janine, Southwest Regional Director, who is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, or Dene, as we say. She has over 12 years of experience as a community organizer and human rights advocate, deeply rooted in local community issues. Beginning from her community in Dene-Bekeya, she has worked on the intersections of climate change, water security, food security, energy development, and nation building with Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led organizations in the U.S., Canada, and Latin America. Working at the national and international levels, as well as local, of governance, she has built expertise in advancing Indigenous peoples' rights through policy and facilitating rights-based approaches to development through holistic, place-based solutions. She has a background in international policy and human rights. Welcome to the stage, Janine. Okay, and yeah, just to kind of indigenize the panel in a way, I just want to welcome you both to share any other pieces of intro information we should know about you all, or if you want to greet the crowd in your language.
Yes, I think Jade's intro was long enough, so I won't add any more details. But my friends and relatives, thank you for allowing me to properly introduce myself for any of my relatives that may be listening in my native language, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
And I don't have anything further to add about my bio. I just want to thank you all for attending. And I know there's a lot of different sessions you could be going to. And this is a really important one for both the center and Indian. So thank you for being here.
Thank you both for being here. And yes, thanks U.S. Center for hosting NDN. I just want to share that it is a privilege to be up here, you know, being the only Indigenous organization, I think, at least on today's schedule. So definitely grateful for this stage to amplify the voices, the perspectives, the guidance of our communities. So I'm just going to jump right in. The topic today is on climate finance of this panel. And is a major topic at this conference and this year's themes of COP28. So that being said, again, climate finance is a major theme in several of the negotiations. So Janine, can you set up some context for us and speak to why this issue matters to Indigenous peoples? What are the potential harms of inequitable climate finance mechanisms that pose to frontline communities, and what are some of the solutions Indigenous peoples are bringing forth here at COP28 to end harmful extractive finance systems?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Jade. As everyone here knows, or anyone who cares about effective climate action, any discussion about those actions is often followed up with the need to have to access the resources necessary to implement those actions and those solutions. And here in this venue, it's also about the resources needed to meet the global commitments that countries are making in order to avert even more climate catastrophe that's impacting those that contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions across the globe, particularly in the United States. And so those urgent responses require meaningful, direct access to the resources necessary to get to the places where people are putting forward effective solutions. And so in these venues, we are really dealing with institutions and with governments that don't really know how to do that. Hence, there's a heavy reliance on institutions like the World Bank and the IMF who are taking the lead and capturing and dominating a lot of these conversations around how these financial mechanisms get developed, how these funds get regulated, the qualifications around them, and therefore impacting how those resources get distributed around the world. And oftentimes, these institutions end up replicating a lot of poor practices because they're not grant-making institutions, and they're not institutions informed by or developed by people on the front lines of these battles and these challenges and who are dealing with the everyday impacts of man-made climate change. And so what we're seeing is that when our financial mechanisms that are developed around these global funds that are being created are dominated by that mindset and by those types of institutions, it's resulting in high debt causing loan-based financial mechanisms and support to communities that can't afford, those types of conditions. And it's also only structured to go to so-called developing nations, prioritizing even within that framework particular ecosystems over others, when as Indigenous peoples, we know that the issue that we're dealing with is interconnected and goes across all ecosystems, all territories, and all regions of the globe, and that we have a responsibility to create and invest in those complex solutions beyond those guidelines. And so the harm that that creates is that it continues to feed and replicate systemic inequalities across these areas. An example of this is the $1.7 billion commitment that was made in Glasgow, which again was one of those things that was set up to benefit Indigenous peoples and what's defined as local communities. Even though we don't know yet what constituency that actually represents. And it was further limited to only go to forest preservation. But even in that like the assessment since that commitment has shown that less than 1% actually went directly to Indigenous peoples, even though 48% of those funds have been expended. And so, the issues and the reason why Indigenous peoples are engaging in these discussions and these negotiations is that all around the globe, we are on the front lines of protecting and preserving what remains of critical biological diversity and ecosystem functions that are important for mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change. But we are also at the forefront of creating innovative solutions to help address the challenges created by the need to transition to forms of renewable energy that are rights-based and that don't harm Indigenous peoples in other areas for the benefit of transitioning in certain areas. And that Indigenous peoples are also doing this at the same time as challenging entrenched power structures that are limiting our ability to create the transformative solutions that are needed by everyone. And so NDN Collective is born out of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Movement. And we were born from a coalition of organizers that are carrying out the development of these mechanisms to get resources where they're needed. And we're from the communities that are directly impacted by the issues that we face. And this shows in the way that our mechanisms and our ecosystem has been developed, and in the effectiveness that we are demonstrating, that demonstrates the importance of upholding and supporting the self-determination of Indigenous peoples is helping us magnify the meaningful impact across these areas despite cultural, linguistic, economic, and even different experiences with colonization and the legacies thereof. And so we're here in this venue to continue that work, to stand in solidarity and alignment with Indigenous peoples around the world who are doing the work to fight these ongoing challenges, to dismantle the legacies of colonization and to name them in these critical dialogues so that we can open the door and chart the path forward for meaningful progress towards effective climate solutions. And that means that we have to be unapologetic in our demands and what we need as Indigenous peoples. And so we uphold the demands that are put forward by the Indigenous representatives, represented by Indigenous Peoples Caucus here, such as direct access to climate finance and climate funding, access for all Indigenous peoples across all ecosystems, development and investment in self-determined funds and financial mechanisms and institutions that uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples, and enhance participation across all aspects of negotiations that are happening here. And this is important because I truly believe that people really want to be effective in what we do, but they don't know how to do it. And so this is where Indigenous peoples bring that holistic perspective for how to enable systemic change. And this is what we're going to support as NDN Collective. And Kim and I both represent the different ways that NDN Collective does that. But together we represent that this is something that can and must be accomplished throughout all layers of these discussions in order to promote effective climate solutions.
This happens often with Janine, just mic drops everywhere. Thank you for setting that context, giving us that background. I mean, we could spend a whole day having sessions just on this panel, so there's lots to unpack. Thank you for naming the systems approaches. I view NDN Collective as a systems approach or a systems model to solving these systemic problems. So not many people know, but NDN is, hence the name collective. It's a collective of entities. And one of our entities, which Kim leads and manages is NDN Fund. So, Kim, as we know, many people are here to develop funding mechanisms and models to create equitable funding systems, aka managing or resource management. Can you talk about what you've developed at NDN Fund to ensure high impact and direct access to Indigenous peoples and frontline communities? Also, can you talk about the tool your team uses to provide debt financing and capacity building services for large-scale resilient and regenerative projects?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, Jade. So NDN Fund is a mechanism to move capital that is part of NDN Collective, and so because of that, we do get to work in close partnership, whether it's around what policies should be in place to most effectively move capital, what types of partnerships in some of our deep dive regions need to be in place so that there are real entities on the ground that can leverage the funds and use them for great impact. We're always working together to do that well. But a little bit about NDN Fund. It is a emerging community development financial institution, or CDFI, which is a type of community-based bank that is not a depository. It just does lending and also what we call development services or power building, which is how we've indigenized that. But more on that in a minute. It is the impact investing arm of NDN Collective, and we provide pre-development, bridge, and large-scale financing for Indigenous, regenerative, community, and national development projects. And these projects are designed to dramatically scale up. We're not talking about small projects here and there. We're talking about large-scale infrastructure that will help us save Mother Earth. So in order to do that, we really follow two core values. The first is the resilience of Indigenous peoples. Resilience is the capacity of individuals, a community, or a system of any scale to survive, adapt, recover, and grow despite vulnerabilities, despite chronic stresses, and despite acute shocks. This is really the groundwork that I'll talk about in a moment. And you know from your own lived experience that vulnerabilities and risks can range from environmental, such as earthquakes and hurricanes, or they can be social or economic vulnerabilities, including the impacts of colonization on our peoples and our lands. Secondly, we believe in the regenerative practices of Indigenous peoples. Regenerative practices are those which support the continuous regeneration of life and the restoring of damaged ecosystems and communities. Regenerative practices can include everything from working with constructed wetlands to purify wastewater and agriculture that nourishes the soil life and the grasses, to enterprises that utilize sustainable, bio-regionally sourced materials and ensure that workers are well-resourced and cared for. We're also really interested in funding net zero energy homes and communities that are designed to nourish our spiritual and cultural lives and make sure that every day is a good day. Excuse me. Stuck. All right. So NDN Fund focuses on core 5 areas, and we're really diligent of making sure that we're not drifting away from those 5 core areas. The first is renewable energy, focusing on community-owned and controlled renewable energy as a transition away from fossil fuels. Community development and housing, focusing on affordable housing and community facilities, because if we don't have safe and affordable housing, we can't do any of this work. Infrastructure, focusing on roads, water, sewer, ecological wastewater, transmission lines, etc. Social enterprise, focusing on innovative business ideas that offer clear social benefits with potential to deliver services at scale. And lastly, regenerative agriculture, focusing on innovations in technology, production, and supply chain that support local food systems. Because again, food is a fundamental right. If we don't have food, we can't do any of this. Indian Fund has 2 lending programs. The Relief and Resilience Fund, which is $50,000 up to $500,000, which supports some of our small-scale efforts, such as our small businesses and our nonprofits that are supporting those small businesses, like other community development financial institutions, and the Seeding Initiative, which starts at $500,000 and goes up to around $3 million. And really, this is the main focus of Indian Fund, which is these large-scale transformative projects that, but for Indian Fund, would not get the funding that they need to do this work. And both of the lending programs are available to tribes, tribal enterprises, indigenous individuals with businesses, indigenous social enterprises, and indigenous nonprofits. We believe capital is a tool, and relationships are sacred, and that really the relationships have been inverted in the conventional banking structure. We need to reverse that. We need to indigenize all of our policies and practices to begin to meet the true demand and need in our indigenous communities for capital. So how do we know that we're having the impact that we want to have? Well, this is where our resilience impact assessment comes in. This was a tool that was developed by climate protectors, Indigenous peoples, other community-based banks, to make sure that we're able to unlock capital that otherwise would not be available because our system is not aligned with the values of indigenous communities, and in many cases are actively seeking to prevent the flow of capital into our communities. So the Resilience Impact Assessment tool gives us the information that we need to be able to make a loan that accomplishes everything that our loan relative, which is what we call borrowers, wants to do in their local community, but that also meets those 5 areas that I mentioned earlier. We apply it to each one of our loan relatives from the beginning, from the eligibility screen. We're already looking at, is this a good fit? Is there resilience built into this loan? Will we be setting up the loan relative for failure by making this loan? Or will we be providing that capital that's going to let them move to the next level of impact? Then we use the Resilience Impact Assessment in all of our quarterly glances into how well the loan relatives are doing with their loans. Are they still resilient? Are they still having the impact that they hope to have to preserve their local culture, communities, and Mother Earth? And if not, what can we do as a high-touch lender that is in lockstep, basically, with our loan relatives all along their path? How can we step in and provide capital that'll help them create a website, do better financial management, partner more effectively with youth and elders in their local community for real-time information about how well the loan is progressing, and so much more. And then finally, we use the Resilience Impact Assessment tool to do our underwriting. We want to make sure that we're asking all the questions. Has the tribal council been involved in the decision making? Because in our communities, sometimes if you don't have the tribal council, and it's not even that they're not in agreement, sometimes they just don't know about the loan that we're trying to make. So we need to make sure that all of those key voices are consulted and a part of all of the planning. We make sure that happens by asking lots and lots of questions during underwriting. And then finally, we have an evaluation, and it's an evaluation of how well the loan relatives are doing towards their goals. And a lot of it is slotted, quite frankly, into areas of resilience that we know matter. How well are they doing on workforce development? Are these good paying jobs with benefits? Are they able to afford housing? What is the social impact of a social enterprise? Is there climate resilience? We make sure that every single one of our loans has a climate dimension. Every single one of our loans is helping to save the planet, to improve our ecological health. And we want to know how that's going and to be able to support it as needed. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about the resilience principles, because I've mentioned the resilience impact assessment, but I haven't given you like that bird's eye view into what they actually are trying to do. So the first one is around process, the ever important process. Has a resilience-based process surfaced traditional knowledge, indigenous values, community objectives, insights, and other information to make sure that all of the decisions that are being made in a good way? Have they been and will they continue to be informed by the most complete and best available information, including, and this is key, the guidance and preferences of the people the decision will touch? Outcomes. Number 2, have all decisions been made and will future decisions be made in furtherance of culturally informed equity and economic empowerment and other clearly articulated outcome goals to meet defined performance standards? Are they doing what they said they would do? And then finally, systems impacts. Have all decisions minimized reasonably foreseeable negative consequences? So the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. Have we figured that all out? Have they figured it all out? And are we furthering the indigenous community and greater system for vulnerable populations, equity, climate mitigation, and disaster risk? I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Kim. So for anyone who's doing implementation work on climate finance or even working on, implementation of climate commitments and investments, these people are the people to talk to because they've built the mechanisms. They've built implementation process that, frankly, we need to get out in the world, and we need to start replicating in different organizations and at the federal agency level. So I'm going to move on to a next question, but I want you all to start thinking of questions you have for Kim and Janine, because we're going to do a quick round of questions. So kind of a lightning round, as best as possible, because this question is loaded. So I want to hear from both of you about your work in the field, right? Because far too often we see climate finance decisions made by people who never step foot into our communities, let alone come to these decisions about our lives from a lived experience either with us or from our communities, and what it's like to be on the front lines. So can each of you speak to how you are seeing big climate funds, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act or the global climate commitments, reach our communities? And are these investments enough to meet the needs of our vulnerable communities? Janine?
Lightning round? No. And you know, I wish I was exaggerating when I said that, but no, because what happens with a lot of these mechanisms is that despite the good intent, there are qualification restrictions and requirements that are structured outside of understanding the context that our communities are working in. I mean, everything Kim described is an antithesis and an alternative to the approach that the World Bank and IMF has always taken on their loans, because it's rooted in love. It's rooted in relationship. It's rooted in a more caring approach and understanding that we're not just working with individuals and with projects that need to be assessed for our benefit over whether or not they make us look good, but whether or not they're what's necessary to meet the needs of the communities on the ground, because it is still extremely dangerous right now. Whether you're in a developed nation or a so-called developing nation, to be an indigenous person that cares for lands, territories, resources, and sacred places. Because every time we stand up in protection of these things, every time we stand up to create a solution that provides an alternative way that centers those things, that centers all sacred life and the value that we have to protect and preserve that, we are in direct conflict with the existing institutions and power structures that benefit from its exploitation, that monopolize and extract wealth from these areas, and that have no incentive to change. And this is why, like, we're working in conditions where across the globe, whether you're in a developed or in a developing nation, indigenous peoples continue to be criminalized for doing the work that we're doing. We do it fancier in the U.S., but it still happens. What we see is like the endemic of violence going unabated against indigenous peoples. These are the conditions that our people are working in. And so they don't have the luxury to just focus on the solutions. And that's why NDN is structured to carry out our work based on 3 pillars: defend, develop, and decolonize. We can't do one or the other. We must do all of it at the same time. And right now, everything that's being discussed in these conversations do not come anywhere near meeting that. Because we can't even agree here at the UN Forum on Climate Change and all of the discussions that are taking place to center nature, or to center human rights, or to center indigenous rights safeguards in any of these discussions. It's constantly being debated, redlined, put back in, minimized, watered down, and this is a practice that needs to stop. If we really are committed to creating effective solutions and approaches, learning from those on the ground that have developed and designed mechanisms for change, for revolution, for movement building, for systemic approaches that help us invest in the solutions that are just as complex as the challenges that we're facing, instead of shying away from that, that's how we can shift and move in the direction that we need to move.
And I'll just comment, like, that is why capacity building, to be able to drive the resources directly to our communities, needs to be built and designed by us, because we understand these conditions best. Kim, same question to you.
Yeah, so I would say, in my experience, there are some U.S. federal agencies that have really been with us from the beginning to build these alternative banking institutions, like the one that I just described, Indian Fund. So the CDFI Fund, the Community Development Financial Institution Fund of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, has not only been providing critical resources to these emerging community-based banks through grants and also loan capital that's allowed us to make these important loans a reality, but they've also done a lot of research to show what the access to capital gap is for indigenous communities. It's because of Treasury's CDFI Fund's research that we know that there are huge parts of the country that are primarily indigenous lands that are essentially banking deserts, where it would take you sometimes a day or longer just to get to an ATM. And then to be able to get financing for a small business would be, an impossible dream for a lot of Indigenous peoples. So we're just so thankful for that entity. And we have a very close partnership with the CDFI Fund. There's another great agency in our federal government, which is the Economic Development Administration, which has provided important funds for Indigenous communities to do feasibility studies and to get the initial capital to actually break ground on a community facility for elders. Or for cultural preservation and other things. I will tell you that in those places where those community facilities and businesses have started, you've seen amazing transformation of communities. But it's not enough. We have to continue to appropriate funds for both of those programs. And that's our advocates like Jade and Janine who go to Washington, D.C. and fight to keep those programs funded. There are other organizations like the Department of Energy's Office of Tribal Policy and Programs that has important funding like loan guarantee programs or even some direct loan programs, but they're not reaching our people. And some of it's just about lack of capacity. Some of it's about lack of awareness. Some of it's about time. They give these short windows to be able to get the capital into our communities, and we know it takes time to underwrite loans, as you just heard me say. I mean, we're very detailed in the underwriting that we do because we're not just making loans, we're also building power while we're making the loans, and we don't want to rush any of that because it's too important. At the same time, we do have a climate crisis, so there are competing demands, and we're making sure that we're moving as quickly as we can. So that's one example. Also, USDA, Department of the Interior, these are all agencies of our government that have capital, but it's just not getting where it needs to. So really what I feel would be incredibly helpful would be an interagency task force that would include Indigenous peoples, that would allow us to dialogue. And this has happened before. Back in the early 2000s, I was part of an interagency task force on microenterprise and small business, and agencies came together across our government, and we were able to do amazing things. So I'd like to see that happen. We'd be building off of the existing programs that are out there, but we need even more. And we need them to be more multidimensional and more climate focused. Because right now I feel like there's a lot of siloing of climate solutions across the U.S. federal government and not a lot of collaboration. So if we could make that happen, I think we'd see a lot of progress in a much faster pace.
Couldn't agree more. Especially around the interagency work. I sit on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and at NDN I've been leading a lot of work around IRA implementation. And when I go back into communities, the grassroots, the front lines, and ask questions about, have you heard about this program? Have you heard about this fund and this opportunity to advance traditional ecological knowledge or scale your renewable energy projects? A lot of people say no. Like, no one's reached out to us except you guys, except us right here. And so NDN, we built it's as simple as a texting tool. We built a texting tool a year ago, really just to tell people when a grant is opening, when a deadline is happening. So it's these types of tools and technology, really accessible things that can make a huge difference. I want to take one question because we are running short on time. So if we can grab one question from the audience, and please make it a question, not a comment.
Raise your hand.
Okay, I see someone in the back.
Hello. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and part of a regional Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center, so I wanted to understand. I know we can exchange different strategies, and hopefully the government will be open to what they learn from us. But I wanted to understand, because we're addressing urban indigenous and rural. So I want to understand what your connection was with that, and where do you see the opportunity to make those changes through that whole national mechanism of the TIC-TAC?
Sounds like an IRA question. But I will give these two just a real lightning round moment to respond to how we're working to impact urban natives in communities, across the country. The TIC-TAC, so we've really found our power or our efficiency and effectiveness in partnering with universities in urban areas to engage with the tribes, engage with the urban tribal organizations or, urban indigenous community centers, to help get those words out, to help with that technical assistance. So, for instance, a program run out of University Arizona, we've partnered with them to, reach folks in places like Phoenix. We've also worked with University Michigan to reach out to places like Detroit. So those programs, so it's not like the benevolent university, it's the native research centers or the native indigenous programs within these universities that have been our true allies in that work. Any other comments around creating capital access to urban communities?
Yeah, I'll say that, Indian Fund has been around for just a few years. So we launched in 2019, and we have made a commitment to making sure that each one of our loans is a little bit different and matches a profile that could be a model for other places. So we do have some urban indigenous loans. We have some reservation-based indigenous loans. We have some rural but not reservation loans. So, coming out of this work, and I mentioned that we have an evaluation, we will have, in a couple years, I think, some really good data on what does it take to do different types of lending. Small business lending in urban, large-scale lending in rural, and then all of the various ways that can go. So watch our website, www.indiancollective.org, and go to the lending tab, and you'll see as much information as we can provide at any given time.
And from the perspective of our grant making aspect, our deep dive program, and just other aspects of how NDN Collective operates, including in actions and in advocacy, we operate from a theory that we are not free unless everyone is free. And so we build partnerships based on trust. We build partnerships based on shared political analysis of the challenges that we are fighting against, of the systems that we are trying to, and the systemic inequalities that we're trying to dismantle, for the liberation of all peoples. And that includes our work that we've been pursuing to show the linkages between Black reparations and Indigenous land back, and the way that our struggles for solidarity, whether it's in urban areas or in rural areas, is shared, and our liberation is shared. And the models and the approaches that we create need to be structured in a way that benefits all peoples.
And to just end on that note, all of this is possible because of organizing. We do organizing in the streets, but we also take our organizing into financial spaces, into philanthropy, to liberate resources. So we're out here liberating lands for our people, creating direct access to build capacity for our folks and with our folks, and also liberating those dollars. So just wanted to end on that note about, we need to be showing up in all these different spaces, and really doing the work, as Janine is saying, to liberate across the board. So thank you everyone for coming to this panel. Again, we have Janine Yazzie and Kim Pate. We are NDN Collective, and we'll see you out and about. Thank you.